Ever since I posted my Sony a6400 review, you guys have been asking me to compare it to the Fuji X-T30. Well, let's get undone. Gerald Undone. He's crazy. What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and not 1 in 100 monkeys sneezed, bees knees trapezed in the monthly breeze, we freeze if you please. Hiawatha. So before we get into comparing this camera to the a6400, let's give it a little review of its own. The X-T30 is interesting. If you think of it as an upgraded X-T20, I think you'll be quite pleased with the results. But if you look at it as a mini X-T3, which I did, it doesn't quite impress as much. I don't really use the smaller Fujis, but I do love the X-T3. At first I was pretty excited because it has so much in common with the X-T3. In fact, it's probably easier to tell you about the things it doesn't have in common because there aren't that many. The main ones are with video and the more limited recording options. There's no all-I or the 400 megabits per second codec. There's no H.265 compression, and there's no 60 frames per second in 4K. And there's no HLG, and it also splits up the files into 4 gigabyte chunks. Even though that was recently fixed with firmware on the X-T3, it's back on the X-T30. It also limits the recording duration to just 10 minutes in 4K and just 15 minutes in 1080p, because this little guy overheats much faster than the X-T3 does, but we'll get more into that when we compare it to the Sony. It doesn't have an ISO dial or that 3-way tilt screen. It only tilts up and down, but not side to side, and it also doesn't have a front function button or the D-pad. You have to do everything with this single little joystick. The burst fire is down to 8 frames a second on mechanical shutter from the 11 frames per second on the X-T3, and the shutter speed is maxed out at 1/4000 instead of 1/8000. And it only has a single UHS-1 SD card slot instead of the 2 UHS-2s on the X-T3. The LCD screen is the same resolution as the X-T3, but the viewfinder is a little bit lower resolution, but both cameras allow for diopter adjustments. And it does offer a clean 4K out over HDMI, maintaining the X-T3's 10-bit 422, but again at 30 frames per second instead of 60 frames per second, but that's still pretty impressive for a camera this size. Anyway, so those are all the things that you would lose if you chose to save the $500 and opted for the X-T30 instead of the X-T3. And the X-T30 is also smaller, which could be a benefit if traveling small and light is important to you, but it also does introduce small camera problems, like not being able to switch out the battery and the memory card when you're on a tripod, because the tripod plate will likely block the door and not be able to allow it to open. But that wasn't a problem on the Sony a6400. It was spaced far enough away that with any of the tripod plates that I tried, I was still able to open the door and get at the battery. But you'll probably find the X-T30 to be a bit more compact as a whole system, depending on the lenses that you use on your a6400, because I find that Sony lenses tend to be a little bit larger on average than Fuji lenses. But if you're coming from the X-T20, then you should look at this as a serious upgrade by packing the sensor, processor, and most of the features of the X-T3 into your favorite little body. And the autofocus is actually the best that Fuji has right now, even better than the X-T3. So for those customers, this is an impressive upgrade. But there are some serious limitations that might make you want to spend the extra money on the X-T3 if video is important to you. First off, the input panel on the X-T30 is not great. It has a mic jack, but it's only a 2.5mm mic jack, not a 3.5mm, and this is the same on the X-T20, but if you're coming from another system, this means you're going to have to get an adapter. And using an adapter on the weakest port in audio, the 2.5mm jack, is just asking for trouble in my opinion. Secondly, the ports are too close together, so if you do end up putting something in the mic port, you likely won't be able to use the USB-C port at the same time. And since there's no headphone jack, the only way to actually get a headphone port is by using the USB-C and using a USB-C to 3.5mm dongle. You actually probably won't be able to use the microphone and the headphone at the same time, and that kind of defeats the purpose of headphones if you don't have a microphone connected to your camera. And while there is an HDMI port, it too blocks the USB port, so don't even think about using power delivery and HDMI at the same time because it just won't fit. And this was disappointing to me because I just made a video on the X-T3 talking about how awesome it is that you can use a power delivery USB power bank to provide continuous power to your camera while shooting, but you can't really do that on the X-T30 if you want to use HDMI or a microphone at the same time. But it turns out these annoyances didn't matter that much anyway when I started testing the battery life and overheating. When it comes to shooting 4K, a fully charged battery will last you about 65 minutes on average, and those are the same batteries that the X-T3 uses, by the way. You do get a bit more life if you shoot 1080p though, up to about 90 minutes. Now, the recordings are capped at 10 minutes anyway in 4K, so heat isn't really an issue unless you plan on doing quick, back-to-back recordings. But I tested the heat using an external recorder so that I could bypass the record limits, and while hand-holding the camera, I hit the thermal shutdown at only 31 minutes. And just like when I reviewed the a6400, I then went on to do a whole batch of tests regarding the overheating to see what the best case scenario was for how long you could get the camera to last. And in those tests I discovered that the boost mode probably has the biggest effect on the camera's heating. And so you're probably best for turning that off in video anyway, because from what I could tell, all the boost mode really affected was the brightness and the refresh rate of the EVF. And just like with the Sony, pulling the screen away from the body and not holding it in your hands but putting it on a tripod extends the life as well. So all those things considered, the best thermal runtime I could get at 4K was using 24 frames per second on a tripod with the screen pulled out. I had boost mode turned off and I wasn't using that much continuous autofocus. And it was just room temperature in here. I did have LED lights on, but it didn't get much warmer than 23 or 24 degrees. And with all those things, I was able to get it to run 69 minutes, and it wasn't the thermal that made it shut down, it was the battery. But the heat warning was up on the screen, so if the battery did last a few minutes longer, it's likely that it would have shut down due to heat then. And that was without recording internally as well. That was only external recording, so it didn't even have to write to the cards inside. So that's likely the longest life you're going to get on this thing when you record 4K, and it's only going to get lower from there if you handhold it or use a lot of functions in the camera, or if you use it in a warmer environment. So that means it's not that reliable of a video camera, and the X-T3 is definitely worth the extra money in my opinion if video is your game. But that doesn't mean the X-T30 wouldn't be great for recording smaller clips while traveling or maybe shooting a little bit of B-roll, and it performs impressively well as a photo camera if the ergonomics aren't an issue for you. Image quality wise, it's the same as the X-T3, although it does have better autofocus like I was saying, but luckily that autofocus will be coming to the X-T3 in a future firmware upgrade, so if you opt to spend a little bit more for the X-T3, you don't have to give anything up except for maybe the compact size of the X-T30. But the larger size of the X-T3 means that you're going to get a full-size headphone jack, and all the ports are spaced out enough to not interfere with each other, and it has better heat dissipation. But you don't necessarily have to spend more money if you consider the a6400 from Sony, which costs the same amount as the X-T30. Now the a6400 is no X-T3 either, and does share a lot of the same shortcomings as the X-T30 when compared to the bigger Fuji, but when you compare the a6400 to the X-T30, it does have some advantages. First off, the screen on the Sony is great. I covered this a lot in the previous video, but this is my favorite screen design, and it definitely beats the Fuji's. The a6400 also lasts a lot longer when it comes to overheating compared to the X-T30, and if you enable the high temperature setting, it can last for hours. There's no recording time limits on the Sony either, so it doesn't require an external recorder like the Fuji does, and when recording internally, they both use 8-bit 420. The Fuji does have a higher bitrate at 200 megabits per second versus the Sony's 100, but having a higher bitrate doesn't necessarily mean better image quality. The Sony also has a true 120 frames per second in 1080p and a proper mic jack, so when it comes to overall usability for video recording, the Sony wins. Battery life is pretty similar between the two, but the Sony's is a little bit better. I consistently got about 10 to 15 minutes longer recording time out of the Sony and about 50 more stills. And speaking of stills, the Sony's buffer is larger as well. The JPEGs are pretty similar at 100 versus 90, but the Sony's RAW buffer is over twice as large as the 19 frames that you get on the Fuji. Both of these cameras have had updates to their autofocus and each excel in a different category. For video, the Sony wins by a little bit. While the Fuji offers eye detection in video, it's just a tad slower to catch up to a subject when moving in and out from the camera. Where the Sony managed to maintain the focus better. Both performed competently, but when put side by side during fast movement, you can see the Fuji drift a little when slowed down to 50% speed. You can improve this on the Fuji by increasing its autofocus speed, but it comes with the drawback of making focus transitions a bit too jumpy. The Sony, however, achieves a nice balance of smooth transitions while still locking onto the face when you want it to. However, in burst photo shooting with continuous focus, the Fuji beat the Sony in my tests. Just like I said in my a6400 review, most of the crop lenses will get you about an 80% keeper rate, and whenever I would do a run of 10 shots at the camera, usually 1 to 2 were soft. And I even tried it on some better full frame lenses, and it still missed 1 to 2 shots. However, the Fuji pulled a 100% hit rate in my tests. I even tried a few different batches and it consistently nailed focus. So for me, the most exciting thing that came out of these tests was seeing how much the focus has improved on the Fuji and being pumped to see these improvements make their way to the X-T3. But this is going to be a noticeable improvement for the owners of the X-T20 as well as any older Fujis as well. Lastly, let's look at noise and image quality. Now the X-T30 is slightly higher resolution, but mostly produces the same images in terms of quality as the Sony. However, there are some differences. In these shots here, the Sony is sharper, and this is likely due to the lens. I was using a Sigma f1.4 contemporary crop lens on the Sony, which is noticeably sharper than the 23mm f2 on the Fuji. If I would have used the f1.4 Fuji lens, it probably would have been a closer match, but that lens costs $500 more than the Sigma, so it's worth noting that it might cost you more to get equal sharpness on the Fuji. The other thing that's different is the impact of the ISO on the images. When the ISO is the same, the noise levels are pretty much equal, but, and this is a huge but, the Fuji is almost a full stop darker. So the Fuji is effectively one stop noisier once you equalize the images. Here, let me show you what I mean in Lightroom. So if you check these images here, the top row are all taken from the Fuji X-T30 and this bottom row is all taken from the Sony. They look pretty similar if you compare them top to bottom, but every shot on the bottom from the Sony had to be taken down one stop in post using Lightroom. If I go in here and go to develop, you can see -1 over here on exposure for this one, and for this one, and yet the Fuji shots are all still at 0, despite them having the exact same exposure settings. And so if we take two of the images once they've been corrected and compare them, and zoom in on one of the darker areas here, we can see that the Fuji looks more faded and noisy now that the Sony's been brought down a stop. But if you were to achieve this in camera, it would be more like comparing a 6400 to a 3200, and if we look at the noise levels there, we can see that the Fuji is definitely a lot noisier once you get into those higher ISOs. So this is going to be a problem if you wanted to shoot at 3200 on both cameras. The Sony's going to be a lot brighter at that 3200, and if you had to bump up to 6400 on the Fuji, it's going to look like this. There's so much more noise here. Overall, I think the X-T30 is a nice little camera and a noticeable step up from the X-T20. It holds its own as a photo camera against the X-T3 and actually beats it in some ways, like we said with the autofocus, at least until we see the firmware update on the X-T3. It is, however, also a noticeable step down from the X-T3 when it comes to video and rigging capabilities, and the X-T3 is definitely worth the extra money if video is your thing. Compared to the Sony a6400, I think the Fuji X-T30 was beat fair and square in this price category. The Sony offers more flexibility in its screen design, battery life, video capabilities, and compact ergonomics without adding much more in its size. And in fact, you'll get the benefits of being able to put it on a tripod and still access the battery door and have a deeper grip, which I prefer. It produces less noisy images when brought to an even exposure and tracks better in video with the added advantage of being able to see yourself. The X-T30 did seem to pull a higher keeper rate than the a6400, and that's impressive. And when you account for lenses, while possibly more expensive, the Fuji does remain a more compact, complete system. So the X-T30 might be the better travel camera, and it's definitely a considerable upgrade for an X-T20 owner. But overall, I enjoyed my experience on the a6400 a little bit more. But that's going to be it for me. I hope you found this video helpful or at least entertaining. And if you did, make sure you leave it the old thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But if you did not find this video helpful or entertaining, feel free to hit the dislike button twice. Alright, I'm done.